let's go hang out with the bacteria in your mouth. Oh yeah, it's time to get oral with Jonathan Dornell and your little buddies up in your mouth. Let's meet them, see who they are, what they can do, how you can love and care for them, and the disasters that can ensue if you neglect to do so. Now, here to guide us on this microbiotic journey through the mouth is Jonathan Dornell. So today we're going to talk about the connection between the oral microbiome and brain health. But before we go there, I would first like to kind of clear up some of these maybe mistaken beliefs or faulty assumptions about the relationship between humans and bacteria. I think in the past decade or so, we've been kind of rebuilding our understanding of bacteria and how they relate to humans in a more positive light. They are not really the demons that we once thought they were. But there still are a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of negative assumptions about what bacteria are, and kind of underappreciating the positive roles they play in our life. They're all over our skin, they're in our gut, they're in our mouth. We're going to focus on the mouth mostly today. But first, let's just sort of kind of reframe what is the relationship between humans and bacteria.
Yeah, that's I think a great place to start to kind of level set both like historically and big picture the state of our relationship with those critters. Usually the place I like to start when having a more like novel conversation for someone who doesn't think about microbes beyond germs, right, and bad stuff is usually bringing it to something relatable. And that typically ends up being food and flavors. For anyone that enjoys coffee, chocolate, alcoholic beverages or non-alcoholic beverages, cinnamon, like just about any various aromatics, perfumes, if you want to get into topicals and other forms of consumables. A lot of these things in nature are dependent on microorganisms for their existence and creation and maintenance. And so I think when we talk about getting back to the food example, yogurt is another one. These things have been processes that humans have traditionally found ways to manipulate and coexist with without knowing they existed for the bulk of our existence. But I would say over the last several thousand years or so, there's definitely been cultures and societies that were able to at least infer while they can't see the alchemy that was happening. It's surprising what happens if you leave that pile of corn or that mash of grains to dry long enough or to be wet long enough under certain conditions that creates a different product over time. And so like fast forward to today and with the advances of technology and our understanding of physics, mathematics, science, and inventions of the microscope and that leading to many other like visual observations and diagnostic capabilities leading to culturomics and being able to culture microbes and be like, oh, we can now see and manipulate the thing. That really exploded to us being able to industrialize the production of foods and consumables that many of us are able to enjoy today. So while I think colloquially, yeah, I would say the past decade or so, there seems to be in the shift, but various parts of our society still does treat and look at microorganisms as like a bad thing and a matter of killing them. And it's like, no, it's been always important to understand how do we coexist with these things, both in nature under states of health and states of disease or imbalance, and trying to understand the links between those things in a ecological way.
And I don't know much about the oral microbiome. When we think of the bacteria in us, we think of the guys down in our intestinal tract, etc., perhaps on our skin. But yeah, can you give us a little landscape of what the oral microbiome looks like and how it differs with the lower gut microbiome or how it communicates with it? Like, just give us a sort of overall picture of what is this little rainforest up in our mouth?
Yeah. Great question. So just to state my position in this debate where I am, I personally consider the mouth as a part of the gut. So you could look at us just being fleshy tubes that are connected from one end to the other. However, the lower part of that tube gets most of the focus, and rightfully so, when we talk about the part of the microbiome in the human. With that said, the oral microbiome, as the name conveys, is specifically looking at the ecology of the mouth, containing all the bacteria and also the yeast, the viruses, protozoa, and any other type of quote unquote qualifying microbe, and how it lives ecologically in this dynamic environment that has uniquely both hard tissues like our teeth, in addition to soft tissues like our gums or cheeks, your soft and hard palate accordingly. Some people have prosthetics in there or dentures. Some people have braces, titanium. And then we do this thing like talking and eating and dental hygiene, which is very dynamic and abrasive and disruptive. So while it can seem very disconnected from the gut in many ways, the oral microbiome is unique for being able to encounter and involve all those processes and behaviors, and yet still contribute to downstream effects that's linked to the quote unquote gut microbiome, because we swallow. And I can't quote the range of amount of saliva we swallow a day, but usually when I find that value, it surprises me, and usually the person I'm telling that number to, like, oh, that's a lot of spit. And so you can imagine how much microbial load is found in some of that spit each time we swallow, which can lead to the opportunity of them colonizing parts of our lower gut. So that's my word vomit way, no pun intended, of demonstrating the uniqueness, but the connectedness of the oral microbiome in this environment here compared to the gut. To speak more characteristically about the oral microbiome, some other similarities is there is wider diversity when it comes to the composition, particularly on the bacterial level, but not limited to the bacteria, when it comes to members found in the mouth versus the lower parts of the gut. However, there are species and probably genera and communities that are uniquely found either only in one of those two locations also. And those differences are due to a combination of both ecological factors and environmental factors, and just our coevolution as a human species with these microbes over time.
But when you tell someone the word bacteria and mouth, we immediately go to like, kill it, mouthwash, I don't know, fluoride, just destroy it, toothpaste, etc. Do we need to worry about killing these bad bacteria? Because it seems like that's what we're trying to do mostly. Should we just focus on nurturing the good ones, or how do we kill the bad ones without killing the good ones? Is it even possible? Or yeah, what do we do with all this bacteria stuff in our mouth?
Great question. My opinion is I think it's important to be able to have a diverse toolkit that both promotes balance and homeostasis at an ecological level. So meaning both having primarily your quote unquote good guys, your good bugs, your good bacteria and yeast and whatnot.
And maybe we shouldn't even be calling them good and bad. Maybe I'm making a mistake by even calling them good and bad. Maybe that's also sort of faulty assumption. This is the good guys, this is the bad guys. So maybe you can clear that up too. But I'm throwing in an extra question. Yeah, continue.
No, that's a great observation. To give you a real life example of that, for example, when we think about gum disease and periodontitis in particularly, there are a couple of quote unquote periopathogens. So the name already conveying like bad guys, right? Being a pathogen, such as Porphyromonas gingivalis and Treponema and a Privitellus species that fall in a group or a classification that's associated with chronic and more severe cases of periodontitis. And particularly Porphyromonas gingivalis can be one of those initiators of the progression of that disease. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it is inherently a bad bug at the, I don't want to say right, but at adequate amounts and or in the right environment when you have a community or a diversity and a health status on the host side that keeps it at bay from overgrowing or to be turning on, say, the inflammatory cascades that it's capable of doing. And so that's why my initial answer is like, I think the toolkit does require needing to be able to, again, promote balance, but also being able to be precise or general at targeting these quote unquote bad bugs or pathogens in cases where it's necessary, right? Like, I don't think, for example, antibiotics are inherently bad, but the overuse of antibiotics clearly has caused many issues in different parts of the world. And it's just a problem that we're dealing with today with antibiotic resistance becoming more prevalent. So I think one way to address that is, getting back to, I think the core of your question is, how do we understand ecologically to live with these microbes and communities in harmony, both locally at different sites of our health and also in our environment? And then how do we do that more at a systems level?
Yeah.
And so that's what's really been fascinating over the last 10 to 20 years when it comes to discussions that microbial ecologists have been having with clinicians and other experts in interdisciplinary spaces to make sense of some of these findings that either have been in front of us for this whole time or that we're just coming to light to due to this unique time of history where we have omics capabilities and resolution to not only ask these questions, but start to follow through and inquire through investigations.
It makes sense though, because if you think of any like natural living ecosystem, like a forest, there's bad guys like snakes and tigers and stuff, and like, are they bad guys? I don't know. Kind of need them. You don't just burn down the whole rainforest. So I guess it's sort of the same in the mouth. What are some of the common ways that people might be unknowingly destroying their quote unquote good guys, or just disrupting the ecosystem itself, that we can easily just like quickly improve our oral health by stop doing certain things or starting doing other things?
Great question. I like the first premise. I think focusing on the obvious basics as possible can go a long way for many of us for preventing some of the lifestyle or modern practices that we have that may be more disruptive than we realize. So those basics being eating a balanced diet and chewing your food. Key part, chewing. Actually mindfully chewing your food. Mastication goes a long way in promoting health over time, and also being able to enhance nutrient uptake and digestion of our food. That is definitely something that can contribute to hopefully a healthier oral microbiome and overall healthy life. And similarly, exercise and getting consistent quality sleep if possible. I feel like whether you're talking about oral health or brain health or many things, I feel like those those pillars tend to be pretty critical in helping and having a strong foundation.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I wanted to start with that is whether you're an athlete, there's different varieties of people who have their version of quote unquote healthy, and also their own like phenotypes and whatnot that might not fit that narrative. For example, the role of, say, like teeth whitening and the success of that campaign in different cultures. I'm not saying teeth whitening is inherently a bad thing, but again, does it make sense to strip or bleach layers of your enamel from that hard tissue? That's not for me to make that decision for others, but that's just like one example of something that some people do regularly now that could be having long-term impacts over time on their health status of their mouth, right? But that's a common oral health practice. Similarly, I think what's been definitely more prevalent and emergent now is a debate about mouthwash use. I'm not here to say mouthwash is inherently a bad thing, but it's wild as someone who's done mouthwash formulations and studied that category. It's like, wow, it's still not hard to find mouthwashes that contain alcohol, and how robust some of these active ingredients are at various either doses or inputs, and them being used to make claims of being able to eliminate or kill 99.9% of bacteria or microorganisms. And so getting back to talking about earlier of like maintenance and balance of an oral microbiome, if someone's been using a mouthwash twice a day for years, there's a good chance that they may be disrupting their oral microbiome or the composition of it, of the microbiota present there. And it's if some of those key microbes that are important, say for nitrate reduction to produce nitric oxide, and that nitric oxide can lead to better maintenance of your cardiovascular health, that could have long-term impacts if they've lost those key members for that cascade of biochemical processes.
Yeah, can you talk more about nitric oxide and what nitric oxide is for people who don't understand, why it's important, how it's made? Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so nitric oxide is a very small gaseous molecule. So very hard to detect. It's something that, once it's present, it's gone that quickly in many ways when you look at a molecular scale. But it is a very important cellular and signaling molecule for various processes throughout the human body. What it's particularly known for is being a vasodilator and promoting healthier and lower blood pressure maintenance. And the place that we typically get our nitric oxide is through a conversion of steps upstream that we get by consuming nitrates from our diet. So your leafy greens, some of your protein sources and whatnot, and nuts. You could think historically being hunter-gatherers and probably having a varied, but sometimes maybe inconsistent agricultural source of foods. When you're chewing and masticating those fibers and those carbohydrates and being able to get those nitrates, the Veillonella and Rothae and these various genera of microbes that are present in the mouth, some of them are uniquely capable of utilizing those nitrates and converting them into nitrite and subsequently nitric oxide. And having those enzymes present in the saliva and the mouth with the assistance of those quote unquote bugs is a key relationship for being able to promote and maintain nitric oxide levels throughout the day for sustaining and promoting cardiovascular health. So again, not everyone eats leafy greens or whatnot, but yet again, there's a variety of ways through supplementation and other means to potentially get that nitric oxide with the help of those key commensals in the mouth. If we have either it's an autoimmune disease or we have oral hygiene practices or some other factors that leads to the reduction or the loss of those microbes, though, there is a reduction in our capability of being able to then convert those nitrates and to produce subsequently nitric oxide. And so the science is definitely very convincing of showing how inadequate nitrate or nitric oxide production in the simulation leading to higher risk outcomes of various heart disease.
Oh, and so this is also one of the reasons why we need to chew our food, we need to masticate. What are some other reasons why? You mentioned earlier, oh, you need to chew your food. Yeah, our parents tell us this, etc., but a lot of us don't. And I still don't fully understand why we need to chew our food. Can you explain more about that?
Oh, of course. Well, the act of mastication does a few things. It promotes blood flow and salivary production. And I don't think a lot of people know this, but the salivary ducts in our mouth are essentially fed through and provided its primary sources from our blood vessels, right? The vascularization that is in this part of the mouth. So simply through chewing and mastication, you're promoting blood flow. You're also promoting the release of amylase and other enzymes that are key for, again, starting the process of digestion. And it also primed your brain and your gut for being able to be ready to make use of those nutrients throughout the digestive cycle. Also, the amount of like endocrinological changes and the role of various hormone signaling throughout, like particularly in oral health, and seeing the role chewing can help for maintaining that maintenance, I think is something that's not talked about enough. But when it comes to the bread and butter of just chewing your food thoroughly and efficiently, not only like promotes healthy biochemistry in your mouth and brain, but it also preps your food to be more readily available for both your body and the microbes that live in it.
And before this conversation, you sent me a couple papers highlighting the link between the oral microbiome and brain health, its connection to things like bipolar disorder, dementia, such as Alzheimer's, autism, Down syndrome, all kinds of stuff. I'm like, whoa, fascinating papers. I'll link those up. But yeah, can we start to talk about this connection between the brain and the mouth? Because you think, how the heck do these bacteria get in there? What is going on? My use of mouthwash, or my eating the wrong foods, or not chewing, etc., this and that, mouth breathing, whatever, could be damaging my brain and causing me to maybe get dementia earlier, or exacerbate my bipolar disorder, or whatever. Yeah, can you teach us about that link between the mouth bacteria and the brain?
Yeah, so I think the research that's been coming out lately focused on this intersection has been interesting, to say the least. Though while it's limited, I think there's definitely room for an interest for more exploration between potential links shown with the oral microbiome and either its status or composition in relation to various neurophysiological and neurological diseases. I think when we're specifically talking about, say, various forms of like dementia, such as Alzheimer's and whatnot, the mechanisms that are being proposed and coming up in these studies tend to fall into, I'd say, one of four buckets that could link potential oral microbiome involvement with either the initiation or progression of something like dementia. First bucket is they call it the microbe and metabolite escape process. And so as you can imagine, the blood-brain barrier is typically held up to be a very powerful moat. It's, it's this sentence like the wall in Game of Thrones that keeps the Night Walkers away from, from the rest of Westeros, aka our brain. But again, technology today and the resolution that we have, and more biopsies and whatnot, show that the brain is not near as sterile as we once thought. It's actually more common or more likely for either various metabolites or microbes themselves to be able to pass through that barrier. And so when we think about oral dysbiosis, periodontitis, associations between the various bugs that might be associated with inflamed responses or inflamed immune statuses of a patient or a host, and if that person also has, say, a dementia, it is possible that there's a link due to some leakage between here and here. And spatially, it doesn't seem all that crazy, right?
Yeah. What is like centimeters, inches away?
Yeah. And we have to remember, like, our circulatory system, if it's doing its job, it's being able to distribute things throughout every aspect of our body from site to site, even if they're fairly distant. But yeah, like many things, the human body is an amazing thing, but it does sometimes have holes and gaps and whatnot, and that includes the blood-brain barrier. And so that inherently allows for there to be an opportunity for, say, someone that has a high carriage load of periopathogens or various microbes that may contribute to a sustained inflammatory state, that activity could have downstream effects. And if that's happening in the mouth, there's a good chance that it's probably having an impact on the brain in the neighborhood next door above it. The next mechanism, I guess I kind of talked about too, I just kind of combined microbe and metabolite escape with neuroinflammation. But to talk more specifically about neuroinflammation, talk about plaque developments with like beta amyloids and all that stuff, right? There's been some very interesting observational studies over the last several years to show that is suggesting that there is a link between the progression of periodontal disease and the incidence of various dementias. And whether that's due to oral microbiome shifts due to the dysbiosis or due to the oral health care routines of those people. Like, I think that still needs to be sussed out and thoroughly studied to truly understand what are the key mechanisms. But I think it's hard to ignore the existing research and the results of that work that is suggesting that there may be an actual correlation, right? And I think, again, spatially and looking at some of the mechanisms such as like Porphyromonas gingivalis, or I sometimes just call PG for the sake of short term or an acronym. PG is known to be a quote unquote irritant. And if it is able to contribute to inflammation in the mouth, it could be also a causal agent for neuroinflammation, directly or indirectly. Directly, if it's able to pass the blood-brain barrier and cause havoc locally, or more indirectly through quorum signaling and other metabolites and off products it produces through its life cycle that may be antagonistic to our immune or neurological health. And then I would say the last two buckets are, I would say, is just like general central nervous system and endocrine signaling, right? Hormone signaling, right? The interactions that are happening between the oral microbiome and the host, the immune status, throughout different stages of the day or at life for various people. What does that look like for men versus women, for an adult versus a teenager versus a child? You can imagine how various compositions and genetics and whatnot may cluster in ways that leads to different interactions that could be associated with the various outputs of health versus disease. So I think there's still a lot of fascinating questions and work to further explore to better understand those later two buckets. But I think when you look at how that biology may take place in other sites of the body that is better understood, whether we're talking about like menopause, right? And the endocrinological changes that happen during that stage of life for women, and how that leads to potentially, developing dry mouth. And it changes. It's fascinating of seeing, like, once you think about the role of the microbiome, whether it's in the mouth or the gut or skin, and then starting to ask these same physiological and biochemical questions we have about aging, it becomes a bit more dynamic if the microbiome does or could have a role in either the prevention, maintenance, or progression of these processes. So now I'm done with those four buckets.
So do these four buckets particularly apply to dementias such as Alzheimer's, or can we also sort of apply them to other things such as bipolar disorder or autism, etc.? I'm particularly concerned about bipolar disorder because I have family members with it. So if you have any information on that, that'd be super cool.
Yeah, I would say that these pathways and the mechanisms associated with them aren't limited to dementias such as Alzheimer's. I think that there have been studies and there might be some evidence that could shed more light in those potential relationships between, say, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or other NPDs, for lack of a better phrase, and then downstream, what are the best ways to potentially treat and manage those conditions accordingly. Again, when you think about the microbiome in place, I try to harp on just like promoting healthy and effective oral health hygiene in combination with either healthcare providers or and people in their realm of practices that just hopefully promote improved quality of life. So getting back to the sleep thing, getting back to the chewing our food thing, getting back to the exercise things, I think those collectively serve better than just being able to choose one therapy, right? But getting back to how that looks for bipolar disorder and whatnot, I think we'll learn a lot over the next 10 to 20 years with, again, the greater resolution that we have with being able to diagnose these conditions and having more longitudinal and higher quality studies to actually assess not only the mechanisms at hand, but hopefully therapies, preventative measures that will be able to help us manage them accordingly.
Oh, so for example, by taking a saliva sample or some swab in the mouth or something like that, we could maybe detect things like maybe bipolar disorder or dementias or whatever early on or during the process. But it might be like a new way to detect these things.
I think there's a potential for that. I can't speak off the top of my head to saying like, yes, there are like salivary or other biomarkers either in the blood or saliva that's easily accessible to be paired with other oral dysbiotic biomarkers. But I think to look at it in a more simpler way, if you can get an assessment chair side at your dentist or at home that can confidently inform you of like your inflammatory status of your like soft tissues and whatnot, and if that's something that is popping up for someone in their 20s or 30s, like that could be the key intervention
Yeah.
for them getting a follow up to assess if, like, maybe something cardiovascular is going on, maybe something neurological is going on. But either way, there's this inflamed state that's being observed, and we need to understand what's the source of it. So then asking more surveying questions of one's oral hygiene and their diet and anything happened in their life recently that was tragic. Again, the body is very dynamic, and it's an amazing operation and machine when it has the resources and tools and information to work accordingly.
Yeah.
But I think we're not at a place where we can just take a saliva test and be like, oh, you have like this % chance of having disease A, B, and C or developing this comorbidity. But I think being able to assess at a higher resolution, like what's the inflamed status of this patient in my chair at this moment, looking at their saliva, and what does that information tell the dentist or the hygienist or the therapist on site, right? And then on top of that, they can actually, especially like dental therapists who focus on neurological health, like they would be a lot more in tune and informed with the status of, say, gum tissues and other features that may link them to refer them to a neuro visit. And right, so it's one thing to have the test. I think it's just another thing, like hopefully that I'm a big advocate for, is promoting an oral systemic health model that really integrates and brings dentists and other oral health professionals or practitioners in the same world and ecosystem as the rest of the healthcare industry to help patients collectively like address their issues and not being so siloed about it. And if you think about it, like there are some people out there who see their dentist more than any other, or a hygienist more than any other health professional.
Yeah.
So if the dentist office can be a space to contribute first, hopefully at a preventative level, and if we have to go beyond that through intervention with the right partners on an oral health team, I think that could be very effective for some people.
Right, because there are a lot of people who are not going, getting their normal checkup or whatever, or they're not checking everything, but perhaps they do go to the dentist. And so through that, they might be able to detect something that wouldn't be detected otherwise. What role does bacteria play in terms of like our cravings, our perception, our desires, our behavior, etc.? Because when you're talking about the people with, say, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, etc., of the people I know with such conditions, they tend to have quite bad oral hygiene habits, not brushing their teeth, etc., eating a lot of sweets, staying up late, sleep is all out of whack, perhaps consuming certain drugs. Not always the case. I'm not trying to lump all these people into one category, but I've noticed a sort of trend there, particularly in like lack of toothbrushing, etc., and eating sort of things that might be harmful to the mouth. And I'm wondering, maybe is a bacteria kind of pushing us in that direction, kind of creating these cravings, kind of leading us to certain behaviors, keeping us up at night, or causing us to crave those sweets, or to not brush our teeth, or whatever. I don't know. This I might be putting too much responsibility on the bacteria, but I'm like, whoa. And it might be a little chicken and egg thing, but it's a huge ass like philosophical question or something. But if you have any knowledge or understanding about that, that'd be super interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to be frank, I am currently in debate internally with my confidence in what roles, particularly the oral microbiome, has in this.
Yeah.
And I say that when it comes particularly with like taste, perception, and flavor science, and the role of like neurogastronomy. To me, that's just like a fascinating realm and intersection of brain science with human health and psychology and understanding our motivations. And then like when you ask the philosophical part of like, it starts begging questions like, do we have free will? Like if the microbes in our gut and body,
Yeah.
right, are influencing these cravings, like I have a sweet tooth and I have sugar cravings. Like this is a part of my life. It's part of my oral health history for better or worse. But it has also taught me or inspired me to learn a lot about the science behind taste perception. And like it's fascinating seeing like, oh my gosh, we have a diversity of bitter receptors. And who would have thought that some of those are directly or strongly tied to immune signaling? And they also seem to have some interactions with key commensals or pathogens found in the mouth when it comes to turning some of those interactions on and off. Right. So if I'm not saying that, yes, they influence our cravings because of those observations, but the fact that there is tangible interaction that can be observed between our structural parts of our own taste biology and perceptions that also is involved with the persistence and maintenance of the oral microbiome. I don't know. Like, is it me or is it the PG that's wanting me to have that extra sweetness that might contribute to more biofilm growth?
Stop blaming your sweet tooth on the bacteria. Own your freaking candy cravings.
Right. And I'm sure you've heard too, like, the mouth is where the gut is. So the connection between the vagus nerve and the signaling between the gut brain axis with all the serotonin of dopamine production, the neurotransmitter production that's taking place literally in the gut, right?
Yeah.
While that activity is not happening in the mouth per se, again, the relationship with taste perception. And as we're starting to unravel that intersection with the oral microbiome or dysbiosis, yeah, like I would not be surprised if future research does paint a picture where the oral microbiome has a role in how we manage all of that. But even outside of the oral microbiome, like for anyone that is listening to this, if you've never heard of neurogastronomy, I highly encourage you to look into that field because it definitely has really shifted my, like further increased my appreciation. I mean, I just love food and flavor / sensory experiences, but it's really impacted the way I think about how I experience food and flavors from like day to day and moment to moment. And thinking about how much of this is a craving driving this versus like in real time smelling coffee on a walk. And how does that lead me to, my next food decision or flavor decision?
Yeah. I'm going to dig into that, but in the meantime, do you have any like fun facts or certain specific things you learned about gastro? I don't even remember the word anymore. Yeah, that you can kind of share with us. I'm going to put you on the spot here, turn you into a little fun fact machine.
Yeah. So I think a key component of neurogastronomy, like at a surface level, is understanding the role of smell, and sensing, right? It's a very important sense that we have. And like someone who's had dogs all their life, I think I've been indirectly very observant of how one's nose could be their respective eyes compared to how much we depend on visual observation for navigating the world safely. But that smell it's amazing what a smell can do for activating a memory, a sensation, a feeling of the past, of nostalgia, to induce hunger or a fight or flight emotion. Like it can be very visceral, right? And a lot of that intensity from a smell actually happens not through the act of eating. It's not the initial inhaling and sniff. It's the retronasal smelling, meaning like as you're chewing your food, like if you're chewing on garlic, if you're chewing on cinnamon, if you're chewing on something that is, I feel like a well-known aromatic, the smell of it before you eat it might not always match the way you think about it. And so the reason why I bring up retronasal sensing is, I hope for people listening, the next time they eat a berry or eat something, before they do, they should sniff it and just be mindful of the aroma before consumption, and then be mindful of that quote unquote smell while you're eating, and see how similar or different it is. And I think if people are mindful of that more regularly, I think their appreciation for the foods and also the decisions why we might gravitate or lean towards those foods may become more clear. And then subsequently having just greater, hopefully, dining and eating experiences that are tapped into your memory and brain space.
Wow, how I had never thought about that. Oh my God. Like that's the smell in your mouth when you're chewing versus the smell when it's out there outside of your mouth is different. Wow. And then that affects what we're liking and our overall experience. That's fascinating.
All right. The chewing, the mastication, the biophysics that's happening during that process, and the releasing of volatiles. But what does that look like if you have a lot of saliva? What does it look like, depending on the mouth conditions and everything else? And the food you're consuming, it definitely is going to lead to a different taste experience and how we perceive it throughout the eating experience. So, and I think another reason why, again, I keep harping about chewing food is because the more you do that, the more you get to, it kind of forces you to also slow down while you're eating to then experience broader flavors versus those who just like inhale their food.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been a traditional inhaler. I'm trying to savor it and chew better, but it's hard sometimes to slow down and chew. How is your sort of chewing routine? No, I mean, like how long? I guess everyone's gonna be different in a way, but we're also all Homo sapiens. Is there certain seconds for how long to chew, or a certain way to chew? It seems like very basic, just chew your food, but maybe you have some additional insights into this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you got to find what works for you. If we wanted to put a time scale on it, I would say for every like spoonful or forkful, and depending on the toughness of it, give yourself at least 5 seconds. Like regardless, just at least give yourself 5 seconds to chew on that mouthful of food.
Bare minimum. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And go from there.
Okay.
I think practicing arts of quote unquote mindful eating, one of the things that works for me just for slowing down is just before even touching the food, just like looking at it for 20 seconds and enjoying the smell, enjoying the plate presentation. If you're at a restaurant, like just taking in all those sensory signals and stimuli around you, right? Is it a colorful plate because it has various veggies on it? Is it a 2-chrome or a 2-color dessert that's just signaling chocolate with a dazzle of raspberry syrup, right? Like, whatever it is, like just even mindfully looking at it without touching it for 5 to 10 seconds, followed by maybe just giving it a smell. I'm that terrible person. Sorry for anyone who's been on a eating date with me. I'm that person that will.
Are you smelling their food?
Unapologetically smell my food.
Getting up on their plate?
No, not their food.
Little doggy.
Right. Just giving a sniff.
But I think that might also be part of the problem is a lot of us we're eating while watching Netflix or listening to some music or whatever, and we're not focused on the food. So that might be part of the initial problem, actually. Is we're not even focused on the food itself. We're just focused on maybe the conversation, which is important also, or Netflix is less important. Yeah.
It's tough, right? Especially when a lot of times you don't have the privilege to just have 30 minutes to mindfully eat, right?
Yeah. Got to get back to work.
It's sometimes for a lot of us, we got to multitask. But that's where, even for cravings, like I think that's where, like with snacks or things that we do crave that might not be quote unquote the best for you. Like I think mindful eating can go a long way with finding that compromise where you have a sugar craving, but if you look at it for like 30 seconds or to a minute and then like just like pick it up but not put it in your mouth, and then maybe like put that chocolate covered almond in your mouth but don't chew it. just let it melt in your mouth.
Just teasing yourself.
You can feel like the rough edges of the almond. But like next thing you know, a couple minutes pass and you had a full experience of that food product may be the way it was designed and intended to be experienced.
Yeah.
Instead of just throwing a handful in my mouth and num 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 swallow, I want more.
Yeah.
Right? Like maybe just like slowing it down and allowing the experience to be step by step.
Yeah.
And being mindful of the sensory changes and experience. Those are the types of practices. Again, most of us don't probably have the privilege to do so in life or anything else. But I think if you can take a moment to do so, even for a snack or not for your entire meal, but maybe for the first 3 minutes of your meal, that will, I think, over time encourage better habits of chewing.
Yeah.
And of plate management and how much we actually do consume.
Yeah. Going back to an earlier topic, we were touching on mouthwash, and we don't need to get into that topic because it's been discussed a lot recently. But I guess it's the alcohol in there that's killing the bacteria, perhaps something else. What about alcohol itself? Say we're drinking beer or vodka or something. Is that also affecting? Certainly, it must be affecting the oral microbiome. How so?
I honestly am not up to date on the current findings and trends of alcohol consumption and its relation to the composition and the status of the oral microbiome. But with that said, when it comes to just the mouth in general, like alcohol is an irritant. So when it comes to those tissues in the mouth, it's not good. Right? It's like,
it can't be good.
It's not good. And right, it's definitely is not good.
Yeah.
And like, I think there's a reason why there's people who are either alcoholics or who are heavy drinkers may experience bouts of dry mouth or xerostomia and the lack of salivary production, or they also might have inflamed and irritated gums and soft tissues that can then lead to other downstream issues depending on either the oral health care or immune status. And so like you can imagine, while it might not seem immediately linked, if I guess getting back to the nitric oxide discussion, if alcohol consumption can impact the likelihood of having nitrate reducers in your oral microbiome, not only is alcohol doing bad things to your body, since you have to detoxify it and whatnot, it is also could be impacting the way you're able to metabolize and utilize a key signaling molecule for maintaining heart health. Right. And so while it might not seem as obvious, you could see through repeated use and regular use that could be problematic.
Yeah, the nitric oxide it's not just keeping our heart healthy, it's also just increasing blood flow and oxygen flow, etc. itself, right, in the brain, everywhere. So if I can feel better, if you got more nitric oxide. And on the topic of oxygen, I know there's aerobic and anaerobic species, genuses of bacteria. How should we think about oxygen in this picture? We breathe with our mouth sometimes, with our nose sometimes. We talk. We open our mouth. Yeah. How should we, particularly with in terms of breathing? I guess we've seen that mouth breathing has damaging effects, but we do have to open our mouth sometimes. So how should we think about this?
Yeah. So first, I'll start off saying like breathing is important. Oxygen is essential for us.
We need oxygen.
But like, yeah, right. With that said, though, like that's a good question. It's like, how can we have an environment, particularly the mouth here, that contains microbes that are both aerobic and anaerobic, meaning like they utilize oxygen or other electron movers for respiration and production of energy. And I think what tends to happen is trying to make sense of that. We're now talking about molecules, compounds, and organisms at a micro or molecular scale. And then what that looks like ecologically when we're talking about an environment with structures and crevices and spaces like the mouth, say between your tooth and your gums, when you combine that with biofilms or braces and other things, there's many environments where even while we're breathing, whether it is mouth breathing or nose breathing, it is possible for these spaces or pockets to contain environments of biofilms or communities of microbes that are oriented in a way that aren't exposed to the oxygen throughout our breathing daily or our saliva as we're swallowing or moving around our tongue or whatnot in our mouth. But with that said, our breathing rate changes throughout the day, whether you're eating versus going to sleep versus you're stressed and whatnot. And also the composition of our oral microbiota and the microbiome changes throughout the day, whether it's due to the circadian rhythm, our oral health habits, when we eat, how and when we swallow and whatnot. So there's a lot of factors and things taking place with all that together, but generally due to the structure and composition of the mouth and the oral microbiome and its environment, while oxygen exposure is common, the whether it is a biofilm or the location of that community with relation to where it is in the mouth, it is possible for some of those microbes to not be exposed to oxygen. Another environment I think is underappreciated is like the tongue. If you look at like an electronic micrograph of a tongue under high resolution, it looks like the Grand Canyon of caverns with all these papillae and whatnot. Whoa. And tissue structures that have crevices that can allow for either like peptides and proteins or polysaccharides or microbes or a combination of those things to make biofilms that make structures and orientate the cells in a way that either include or exclude oxygen and other gases and metabolites.
And I guess we can't complete this discussion without briefly mentioning probiotics, actually supplying these bacteria into our body through foods, and prebiotics, prebiotic fiber that feeds these bacteria. There's a lot of information already out there on this, so we don't need to dive deep, but is there anything you'd like to touch on with regards to probiotics or prebiotics?
Yeah, I think the application of prebiotics, probiotics, and also postbiotics, we want to throw that into the biotics toolkit. I think there's both useful and underutilized applications when it comes to oral health. I would say historically, caries or the prevention of cavities has been one of the most targeted conditions through the application of probiotics and prebiotics, whether we're talking about gums or lozenges. So you can imagine like these vehicles or again, chewing a gum that has, say, xylitol and let's say a key lactobacillus species. That xylitol can serve as a carbon source that the xylitol found in a gum that could be used as a prebiotic. That could be a carbon source that challenges cariogenic bacteria such as Streptococcus mutans to metabolize a substrate that does not lead to the production of lactic acid. And so that's just one example of using a prebiotic like arginine or xylitol to provide a different substrate that does not lead to the acid production that underlies caries. Similarly, you could use nitrate, right, as a prebiotic, or you could directly use probiotics in a gum or a lozenge to directly introduce microbes and metabolites that could either compete with or subdue cariogenic or periodontal pathogens in the mouth. And so I think there's other applications beyond gums and lozenges, even including rinses with the right applications. There's pastilles. I've seen interesting like straws, and like even like people using toothpicks and whatnot that have been infused with various actives. So I think there's some interesting applications that could be used to manage or help prevent gum disease or bad breath or other oral conditions that are prevalent in various populations. But as you know, there's also that much more room to do more longitudinal studies at high quality to be able to have the confidence in the efficacy and dose and administration of these things accordingly.
Yeah. And one last thing I have to ask about is sugar, because sugar has been sort of the main target in terms of all of this. Like, oh, don't eat the sugar; it's going to give you caries, it's going to give you cavities. Eliminate the sugar. I assume that's true, but maybe we have misunderstood that a little bit too. You can also talk about artificial sweeteners as well. This is something I'm curious about. I'm like, Because whenever there's like a sort of a general opinion about something, everyone agrees on it. I'm always like, questioning it. Is it really right? It might just be really right that sugar is just bad for our oral microbiome for our teeth, but I imagine there's something more going on here.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, right?
Yeah.
Like I I have a sweet tooth, so I'm biased, right? I am
Yeah.
not gonna demonize sugar personally, like because it's not the cause of cavities. It's the metabolism of sugars, particularly your glucose and sucrose, right? Your the metabolism of those simple sugars into small carbon acids that lower the pH of your saliva or the local environment. And it's that process that underlies the formation of cavities and carious lesions. So, right, is it the sugar? Is it the carcinogenic bacteria? Is it the opportunity of those things coming together? Right, it's that's what I'm saying. Sugar is not the cause per se, but yeah, like I can speak to this if I and it's also my days when I was an athlete. If I'm drinking high sugar containing electrolyte drinks or beverages or foods, and say I'm not having that with water sufficiently, or if my biology has low salivary flow, or if I'm not chewing my food with in conjunction with those sweets, right? There's some people who are going to have a higher incidence or lower incidence of having the formation of cavities depending on how much sugar they consume.
Yeah.
Subsequently, though, like our perception of sweetness can directly or indirectly play a role in that. Like there are some people who literally are sensitive sweet tasters. So a very little amount of sugar or sweetness goes a long way for them. And so a little bit might be too much and they might be wired without knowing to just not consume as much sugar, which could lead to lower likelihoods of having cavities. Whereas some people might have a high tolerance and
You.
threshold for their perception of what qualifies as sweet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so they might be predisposed to higher chances or a higher likelihood of developing caries just due to if they have a sweet tooth and they want to hit that threshold, they just might have to have foods or things that contain more sugars to experience that sensation.
Yeah. Well, I do have tons of more questions, but they're going to have to wait. I'll choose the final one. The final question is going to be, yeah. Do you have any favorite species or genus of oral bacteria? Like, ooh, I love this guy because of this or that.
I'm a fan of the Veillonella genera, like particularly Veillonella or Veillonella, depending on how one chooses to pronounce that term. Veillonella dispar and parvula. That group of microbes, they are nitrate reducers. And they are also common commensals found in the oral microbiota. So I'm particularly a fan of that group and those two species specifically because of that biochemical contribution in nitrate reduction. And then also my bias coming in from my doctoral research of working with various strains of those species and seeing how their interactions at a microbial level, what they look like through different forms of symbiosis with cariogenic bacteria versus, say, fungi like Candida albicans and other Candida species. It was just really fascinating of seeing its behavior and how it was able to coexist or not, depending on other community commensals and a biofilm model, and then subsequently seeing how those associations may play out in nature. So I'm a fan of its biochemistry and its particular role / niche in the oral microbiome.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I know you have a podcast. Let's Get Oral. I'll link that up. Is there anywhere else we should go to learn more or connect with you?
Yeah, if you're interested in learning more about myself or the Let's Go to Oral podcast, you can find us on your socials, so LinkedIn, Instagram. The podcast is on, it should be on essentially just about any streaming platform. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon, Stitcher. I don't know if Stitcher is even still around anymore, Podcast Addict,
Yeah.
etc. And And you can also go to the website letsgetoral.com to stay tuned in to our ongoing series focused on oral systemic health.
Are there any general resources, books, other experts, etc., that you would recommend us to go to if we want to dig into this deeper?
Ooh. Yeah, yes, I'm just
Yeah, you're thinking.
I'm being overwhelmed in my brain of like
Yeah.
where to start, right?
Uh,
Because there's definitely hella books. What Your Mouth Says, I think, is a book from Dr. Cami Haas. That's one. If there's an organization or society, I recommend just following the Integrative Dental Medicine Scholar Society. I think it's a good one for healthcare professionals just interested in the concept of oral systemic health. So whether you're in cardiology or urology or you're in dentistry or whatnot, I think being able to connect with like-minded peers in different disciplines who are part of an association like that or AOSH or the American Oral Health Society. These are all different organizations that I think are very resourceful and also ways to be able to connect with people who are just wanting to improve quality of life for everyone.
awesome. Yeah, communities, those are the best. Even better than books or a single person. So thank you for that. And thank you for this wonderful conversation today. Thank you so much, Jonathan. See you around.
Yes. Thank you for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.